Richard Nixon, a man shaped by the socio-cultural conflicts of his time, led an upset victory in the presidential race of 1968 by taking advantage of the deep cultural disputes within the nation at the time. Emboldened by his widespread appeal, President Nixon ushered in a new era of conservatism at home and asserted America's growing power abroad.
Nixon's controversial management style and his direct talks with the communist adversaries of the United States were jarring to many, as was his infamous demise during the Watergate scandal. However, his continued efforts to push the influence of his nation further throughout his presidency and after sealed his legacy as one of the most masterful negotiators in the nation's history.
Richard Milhouse Nixon was born on January 9, 1913, in a humble farmhouse in the small town of Yorba Linda, California. At a young age, Nixon encountered the hardships of the real world as his family went through financial troubles and loss, and he worked hard along with his family to make ends meet.
Early on as a student in Whittier College, Nixon displayed a keen interest in student government, politics, and law, and maintained a diplomatic demeanor that became a notable aspect of his personality. In the 1930s, he went on to attend the Duke University School of Law, where he served as president of the Student Bar Association, coordinating the professional and social activities of the student body and acting as a liaison between the administrators, faculty, and the students.
Since his time in college, Nixon pursued a diverse range of government careers, from working as an attorney at the Office for Price Administration in D.C., providing with first-hand exposure to the issues with the government bureaucracy that later shaped his economic actions through his presidency, to serving as Lieutenant Commander of the U.S. Navy.
In the election of 1952, Nixon, then a U.S. Senator of the state of California, was selected to run as Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower's vice president. During the campaigning period, he was accused by critics who claimed that he laundered $18,000 from supporters in return for the promise of political favors. True or not, in his landmark Checker speech, Nixon attempted to ice the flame that threatened to destroy his campaign by countering this accusation and claiming that he would not commit such an immoral act, and indicated his pleasure towards the VP position.
And as a man whose honesty and integrity has been questioned. Now, the usual political thing to do when charges are made against you is to either ignore them or to deny them without giving details. I believe we've had enough of that in the United States.
It was quite a masterful speech that inherently saved his political career, strategically outlining goals for himself and showing the public that he was capable of following through with them.
After the two progressive administrations during the 1960s, the Republican Party needed to appeal to new voter bases in order to garner support and win the election of 1968. The Republicans found the perfect candidate in Richard Nixon. With the Civil Rights era coming to an end and many white Americans beginning to despise the integration of African Americans to American society, the Republican Party needed to strike a perfect balance between embracing the integration efforts of the time and thus alienating much of the South, and taking a hardline pro-segregation approach to capture the Deep South. With the Democratic Party still in strife after the death of Robert Kennedy and the departure of Lyndon Johnson, and many of the Deep South segregationists rallying around Alabama Governor George Wallace, Nixon slipped into the national spotlight through dog-whistling pro-white campaign platforms, such as busing opposition and relaxed school integration timelines, which allowed the Republicans to capture urban voters in the North as well as more traditional Southerners. With his newfound power, Nixon and his Republican Party tapped into the strong forces in America at the time, effectively putting an end to the Civil Rights era through the election of a president who did little to integrate American society and quell the national debate over race relations.
Nixon's election also came at a time of great uncertainty over the brutal war in Vietnam, which was finally revealed to the American public as an uphill battle through the advent of the television. This controversial war haunted Johnson, forcing Nixon to take an anti-war stance to appeal to the public. With the pressures of mass protests on his administration, Nixon implemented the Vietnamization policy, which transitioned the war over to the South Vietnamese military and began America's withdrawal from the nation. In a moment of relief within the nation, Nixon's ability to connect with the political environment soothed a raging debate over the progress of the war, setting a new course for abatement of the situation in Vietnam.
This attitude was solidified in the Nixon Doctrine in 1969, which diminished America's involvement in other nations, especially those surrounding Vietnam, and conveyed Nixon's idea of a world in which nations cooperated to maintain peace instead of one where the United States would serve as the main peacekeeping force. This monumental pivot in American foreign policy highlighted the demands of many in the country at the time, who believed that the United States should tone down the war effort and shift towards maintaining peace as opposed to dragging out the Soviet-US geopolitical conflict.
Regardless of his nature and motives, Richard M. Nixon was the epitome of a strategic and complex debate. Throughout both of his presidential terms, Nixon made multiple groundbreaking and bold diplomatic moves that no other president had dared to make.
Only 16 days after his inauguration, on February 6, 1969, Nixon formally announced that he intended to visit Western Europe around the Brussels area towards the end of the month, his first foreign trip. One of the goals was to establish the principle that the United States would consult its allies first before approaching their adversaries for negotiations.
He wanted to emphasize that he favored intimate and frank consultations, and also stress his motive to revive the historically strong bond between Western Europe and the United States, seeking a durable peace as titles in a New York Times paper from the time of his voyage mentioned, and shift focus away from Vietnam-centered diplomacy that had been characteristic of his predecessor, President Johnson's policies.
Nixon first set the precedent for visiting mainland China while in office on the morning of February 21, 1972. Such an action was unheard of at the time, but is now a common routine diplomatic action taken by nearly every U.S. president. Nixon strategically requested his 7-day visit to be aired on home televisions accessible by millions of American citizens, many of whom were able to get their first glimpse of life behind the communist bamboo curtain, as he attended cultural events and performances, formal banquets, and toured the city, schools, factories, hospitals, and other common areas.
This allowed Americans not only to see the hidden Chinese nation, but also witness the interaction between Nixon and Chairman Mao Zedong, and Nixon's skillfully tactful nature and composure, increasing his likability and positive impression on fellow Americans. The visit itself was hailed as the week that changed the world, as this rather peaceful crossing of ideological boundaries served as significant and symbolic development in international politics, demonstrating that it is not necessary for philosophical and ideological opinions of any nation to affect their relation with another country. The brilliant diplomat in Nixon gave a toast at the first banquet of his trips, stating the following:
"We have at times in the past been enemies. We have great differences today. What brings us together is that we have common interests which transcend those differences. As we discuss those differences, neither of us will compromise our principles. But while we cannot close the gulf between us, we can try to bridge it so that we may be able to talk across it." Richard Nixon.
However, the iconic shaking of hands between Nixon and Zedong set the stage for better diplomatic relations between the superpowers and allowed for business and social ties to flourish in the coming decades. Similarly, Nixon was the first sitting president to visit the USSR. Like with his China trip, when venturing to Moscow for the historic summit and meeting with Soviet leader Brezhnev, he put aside the obvious clashing of ideological principle between the nations and frankly approached the Soviets with open arms of conciliation.
Notable outcomes included the laying of groundwork for joint flights and the signing of Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT, arguably the most significant as both nuclear powers limited themselves to 200 anti-ballistic missiles.
Although it had its ups and downs, Nixon's presidency was by far one that shaped America's reception of capitalism rather than communism and methods of strategic diplomacy with nations overseas, but also brought into question the limits of presidential power in regards to their motives and diplomatic actions.